Today I'm trying a Jamaican style meatloaf. I know when most people hear meatloaf, especially non-Jamaicans, this is not what comes to mind. You might be thinking about a loaf made entirely from minced meat that you bake in a loaf pan, but instead it's a soft, fluffy bread dough stuffed with spicy beef filling. It's delicious. A prerequisite for Jamaican meatloaf is that the filling should be spicy, juicy, and extremely flavorful. Typically, you can get a meatloaf anywhere you can get a Jamaican patty to buy. It's not as popular, but it's just as yummy. And I think they use the same spicy mincemeat filling for the patty. Although cheese might be an option, it's usually sold without it. But I love a mouth-watering cheesy meatloaf, so that's what I'm doing today. The doughy part of the meatloaf is made from a bread dough. This mild crust complements the rich, spicy flavors of the filling perfectly. Let's get right into it. So, the very first thing we need to work on is that delicious filling. You can do this overnight or keep a stash in a freezer if you want to make meatloaf fairly often. For the filling, we need to dye some staple Jamaican seasons. It's a pretty simple assortment of some key ingredients. Thyme, pimento, and scotch bonnet pepper gives that authentic Jamaican flavor profile. Garlic and scallion for a depth of flavor, and tomato and sweet pepper. These help keep the meatloaf juicy. Alright, so get a fry pan hot and heat it with a generous amount of oil because we want a proper saute. Get that hot and add half a tablespoon chopped garlic, 2 tablespoon diced onions, 2 tablespoon scallion, chopped scotch bonnet pepper. This is a tablespoon, but add less if you can't manage the heat or start with a little and taste and adjust so you don't overdo it. A piece of thyme. Fresh thyme has the best flavor. Let those start brown, then add 2 tablespoons of chopped sweet pepper and a tablespoon of diced tomatoes. I remove the seeds. A tablespoon of tomato paste. You want to saute this properly. The tomato paste adds depth of flavor and a bit of acidity to offset all the richness from the meat. A half tablespoon curry powder and a teaspoon of coriander powder. Saute everything until the curry and coriander is fragrant. Notice the missing oil, that's why we start with extra, otherwise we sweat the season, which isn't the best way to build the flavors we want. Next, add quarter pound of lean ground beef and break that down. Add half tablespoon brown sugar. This really brings everything together and balances out the spice. Next, we need a teaspoon of allspice, aka pimento. Freshly crushed grains have the best flavor. Pimento is bomb in this recipe, so if you have it, use it. I've seen recipes call for breadcrumbs in the filling, and a lot of patty companies add it. It bulks up the filling and helps to keep it moist. This recipe is good without it though. Add some salt to taste. Next, add quarter cup of water to the glaze and let that simmer and reduce. This should take around 5 minutes. This smells damn good. When we are done cooking the filling, we will remove all the extra oil. If I skimmed on the oil earlier, I couldn't build the flavors I wanted, but if we don't remove the oil, it's going to mess up the crust when we bake. A strainer works pretty well for getting rid of the oil. The oil is pretty flavorful, by the way. I'm going to put this in a container and let it cool. You can make the filling and keep it in the fridge for a couple days or a few weeks in a freezer until you're ready to make meatloaf. Perfect. The spicy, juicy, flavorful beef filling is ready. I let that chill in the fridge while I work on the dough. Okay, so for the dough, we need 1 cup of milk. Water is good here too. A tablespoon of sugar, half tablespoon active dry yeast, half teaspoon salt. Yes, salt inhibits yeast activity, but adding salt like this won't outright kill all the yeast. Just slow it down slightly so it's really not a big deal. And adding salt now helps with strengthening gluten, giving the dough much better texture and structure. Mix well to dissolve everything. This is going to take close to 3 cups of flour, but I like to start with a dough that's too wet, so I'll add only 2 cups now and mix well to make a shaggy dough. I let this ferment at room temperature for half an hour to 45 minutes. Could also ferment this in the fridge. It would take longer, but it would be much more flavorful. Using a spoon makes this first step a lot less messy. So after about half an hour, the dough has doubled, still sticky. Gradually add the next cup of flour and mix until the dough comes together. Work in that flour so it can hydrate. The first ferment helps to develop some gluten without kneading. So I'm going to knead until the flour is mostly hydrated. After I have a firm dough, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of butter. I diced this earlier so I can mix it in easier. Butter and other fats make developing gluten much harder, so I like to add it late in the kneading process. When my dough already has some structure, I'm going to knead this until it gets smooth. This is about 5 to 8 minutes of kneading before I cover and set it aside to proof. My kitchen is a bit hotter than room temp, so to avoid overproofing the dough, I'm only going to let it raise to 50%, which takes about 15 to 20 minutes. When that's done, I'll get that on the work surface and fold it over onto itself to form a tight ball. This gives it some structure. I'm going to divide this into three because we will be making three loaves. This is optional because you can just eyeball it, but I weigh the dough and divide it so I can get as close to three evenly sized loaves as possible. I like consistency. A big mistake I kept making earlier in testing this recipe is using too little dough to make each loaf. You need the dough to be thick to hold the filling, and we want a good dough to filling ratio. After I'm done dividing the dough, I'm going to fold each piece over onto itself and form into a tight ball. Looking back, I could have made 4 loaves instead of 3. I will end up with some excess, but I'll show you a solution for that problem. Before I roll out those balls, let me show you what a thin dough does. This is absolutely delicious, but you might notice how thin it is. Thin doughs with fillings inside are a recipe for disaster, and this has a decent amount of fat that will break down the dough and leak while it bakes. Alright, so grab one of those balls. To roll out the dough for my meatloaf, I'm going to lightly dust the dough on rolling pin and roll out at the very least 1/4 inch thick. Rotate the dough after each roll so it's as close to circular as possible. This will take 3 tablespoons of filling. I'll start with 2 tablespoons first on one half of the dough. On goes my cheese. Fold that in half and then add the third tablespoon. If I added the cheese on top, I would end up with something like this where the cheese is all on one side. Just pull the other half, the mostly empty half, over the filling to form the loaf and press firmly together. I have this pastry wheel that cuts and seals the dough at the same time for that clean, professional look. That's a good looking loaf. So I ran out of grease paper and didn't realize till getting to this step, so I'm going to be using my non-stick pizza pan, which I grease lightly with butter. This worked out so much better though. If you're like most people and don't have a pastry wheel lying around, you could use a fork to seal the loaf. Just go around the edges and press firmly. This ended up still neat and you won't have the extra trimmings to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to make the rest of the loaves. I'll just repeat all the steps. I am using tasty cheese singles by the way, but whatever cheese you like is fine. I've used mozzarella in this recipe already for that satisfying cheese pull. It's kind of bland, but still good. I will have extra filling left over from this recipe, so I'm going to put it in the fridge and make another batch next week. On to the last loaf. Using a pastry wheel to seal the dough will always leave some trimmings. As I mentioned earlier, I'll show you how I handle these. Gather the trimmings and fold it over onto itself to form a ball. Dust with flour and I'll go ahead and roll it out. I'm going to roll this out much thinner than I did with the meatloaf. Then brush that generously with butter, fold in half, brush, give it another fold and use your fingers to poke 3 holes. And voila, cocoa bread. This goes on the baking tray with the meatloaf and we'll proof one final time before we bake. I'm going to put my oven on warm, which is about 45 to 50 degrees, and place the loaves in for about 10 minutes. So the dough can do its final rise. You could let them rise at room temp as well, would take a little longer though. Oh, and I almost forgot. Spritz it with some water. This will help give it a nice crust and help with the rise. When they double like this, I'm going to turn the temperature up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. This will bake for 20 to 25 minutes and I will rotate the pan something like every 8 minutes or so they brown evenly. They should be nice and golden. Pull them out and brush with butter while they are still hot. That's buttery. It's always nice when a kitchen smells like a bakery. I'm gonna have this cocoa bread right now and let the loaves cool off a bit. This was made from trimmings but it's still top tier cocoa bread. Alright, time to blaspheme. No Jamaican will be caught dead cutting a meatloaf with a knife. Just like patty, you bite into it when it's scalding hot and let it cool in your mouth. This juicy. You can smell the spices, and the ratio of filling to dough is perfect. I love the crust on that. And this tastes so amazing. Everything is balanced. The crust helps to temper the richness of the cheesy meaty filling. It's hot, spicy, and extremely flavorful. When researching recipes for the filling, it usually calls for soya sauce, but that usually makes the meatloaf way too rich, especially if I added cheese. So I couldn't get through an entire one. That is it right there. Jamaican style cheesy meatloaf.